Sheriff James Winters stared out his living room window as snowflakes danced in the cold December air. The Christmas lights from his neighbors' houses made colorful dots in the darkness, but his own home stayed dark except for a small tree in the corner. His coffee had gone cold, just like the empty house around him. At 58 years old, James had seen many Christmas Eves come and go in this small Georgia town, but this year felt different. The golden badge on his uniform, which he hadn't bothered to take off after his evening patrol, felt heavier than usual. 20 years of serving Pine Grove County had left him with more gray hair than brown and more questions than answers. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from his daughter Amy in California. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Wish you could be here." The kids missed their grandpa. Attached was a picture of his grandchildren decorating cookies. James smiled at the photo but didn't reply right away. The truth was, he could have been there. Amy had invited him weeks ago, but something kept him in Pine Grove, something he couldn't quite explain. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8, its deep chimes echoing through the empty house. Sarah, his wife of 32 years, had loved that clock. She'd polish it every Sunday without fail, right after they came back from church. But Sarah had been gone for 2 years now, taken by cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. Sometimes, James still set 2 coffee cups on the counter each morning out of habit. He walked to the kitchen, his boots making heavy sounds on the wooden floor. The refrigerator held leftover pizza and a container of fruit salad that Linda, his secretary at the station, had forced him to take home. "Sheriff, you can't live on coffee and donuts," she'd said, sounding so much like Sarah that it made his chest hurt. Picking up the framed photo on the counter, James looked at his younger self in uniform. It was taken on his first day as sheriff, Sarah standing proud beside him, and their kids, Amy and Michael, grinning in front. Michael now lived in Atlanta with his wife. Too busy with his law practice to visit often. The town had been different then, simpler maybe. Or perhaps he had been the simpler one. Recent months had brought new challenges. Tensions in the community had grown after incidents in other parts of the country. James saw it in the way some people looked at his uniform now, with distrust instead of respect. He tried to build bridges, started community meetings, and made sure his deputies treated everyone fairly. But sometimes it felt like swimming against a strong current. The TV droned quietly in the background, showing a Christmas movie he'd seen a dozen times before. James walked to his front window again, watching as Mr. Chen from across the street helped his grandchildren build a snowman. Last week, Mr. Chen's store had been vandalized with racist graffiti. James had personally cleaned it off before Mr. Chen arrived for work, not wanting him to see it. They'd caught the teenagers responsible, but the incident left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Looking at his Christmas tree, James remembered how Sarah would insist on decorating it the day after Thanksgiving. This year, he put it up just yesterday, a small 3-foot artificial tree that came pre-lit. A few ornaments hung on it. One Sarah had saved over the years, each with its own story. The angel on top tilted slightly to the left, but he couldn't bring himself to fix it. His police radio crackled to life. "All units be advised, roads are getting icy. Highway 23 is closed due to conditions." James acknowledged the call, grateful for the distraction. He should probably go check on old Mrs. Rodriguez. She lived alone on the outskirts of town, and these cold snaps were hard on her. Putting on his heavy winter coat, James grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. Sarah's coat still hung there too, her favorite red one with the broken zipper she'd meant to fix. He'd thought about donating it 100 times but never could. As he opened the door, the cold air hit his face, bringing with it the silence of a snow-covered world. Little did Sheriff James Winters know that this Christmas Eve would be different from any he'd experienced in his 20 years of service. As he stepped out into the snowy night, fate was already setting in motion events that would change not only his life, but the entire community of Pine Grove. Sarah Thompson pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body as another cold wind blew through the quiet streets of Pine Grove. At 17, she never imagined she'd be walking alone on Christmas Eve, one hand resting protectively on her 8-month pregnant belly, snowflakes catching in her dark curly hair. The street lights cast long shadows on the snow-covered sidewalk. Her feet were getting wet through the holes in her old sneakers, but she kept walking. The women's shelter where she'd been staying for the past 2 months was full tonight. "Christmas brings out the worst in some folks," Miss Betty, the shelter manager, had said with sad eyes while turning her away. She tried to give Sarah some extra food and a warmer jacket, but Sarah couldn't take them, knowing others needed help too. 6 months ago, life had been different. Sarah had been a regular high school junior, dreaming about college and becoming a nurse like her mother. But then came the pregnancy test with its 2 pink lines that changed everything. When she told Marcus, her boyfriend of 2 years, he blocked her number the next day and transferred to a different school. Her parents' reaction had been even worse. "No daughter of mine is going to bring shame to this family," her father had shouted, while her mother cried in the kitchen. That night, Sarah had packed what she could carry in her school backpack and left, the sound of her father's angry words following her down the driveway. Sarah stopped walking for a moment, catching her breath. The baby kicked, making her smile despite everything. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, rubbing her belly. "We'll figure something out." Her grandmother's old stories came to mind, especially the ones about Sheriff Winters. Grandma Martha had worked at the courthouse for 30 years, and she always said the sheriff was a good man with a kind heart. "That man helped me change my tire in the middle of a snowstorm," Grandma Martha used to say, her eyes twinkling. Didn't matter to him that I was just the cleaning lady, or that I was black. He stayed until the job was done, got himself covered in mud, and still tipped his hat to me like I was the mayor's wife. Looking up, Sarah realized her feet had carried her to Cedar Street, where the sheriff lived. Grandma Martha had pointed out his house once, proud that she knew where all the important people in town lived. The house stood quietly in the darkness, with just a small Christmas tree visible through the front window. The cold was really biting now, and Sarah's fingers had gone numb. She'd lost her gloves somewhere between the shelter and here. Her stomach growled, reminding her that the last thing she'd eaten was half a sandwich at lunch. The baby seemed to kick in agreement. Tears started falling down her cheeks, freezing slightly in the winter air. She thought about her warm bedroom at home, with its purple walls and photos of her friends. Her mother would be baking Christmas cookies right now, filling the house with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon. Her little brother would be trying to peek at his presents, just like every year. A car drove by slowly, its headlights making Sarah step back into the shadows. She learned to be careful these past months. Some people saw a pregnant teenager and thought they could say whatever they wanted. Others looked at her skin color and crossed to the other side of the street. But the worst were the ones who pretended not to see her at all. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Sarah looked at the sheriff's house, remembering more of Grandma Martha's stories. How the sheriff had helped set up a college fund for his secretary's kids after her husband died. How he'd started a youth program at the community center. How he'd always listened to Grandma Martha's concerns about the neighborhood, even if he couldn't fix everything. Taking a deep breath, Sarah touched the small cross necklace she wore, the last birthday gift from her grandmother before she passed away last year. "Give me strength, Grandma," she whispered. Then, with trembling legs that weren't just shaking from the cold, Sarah Thompson started walking toward Sheriff Winters' front door. Her heart pounded with each step up his porch. The Christmas wreath hung slightly crooked on the door, and through the window, she could see the tree lights blinking slowly. Somewhere in the distance, church bells started ringing, marking the late hour. Sarah raised her hand and, after one final prayer to her grandmother's memory, knocked on the door. The sound of Sarah's knock seemed to echo through the quiet winter night. Her heart beat so loudly in her chest that she was sure anyone within 10 feet could hear it. The porch light suddenly came on, making her blink and take a small step back. Through the frosted glass panels of the door, she could see a tall figure moving closer. Sarah's legs felt weak, and the baby chose that moment to do what felt like a complete somersault in her belly. She placed one hand on the porch railing to steady herself, while the other remained protectively over her stomach. The wool of her thin sweater was damp from the snow, and she could feel herself shivering more with each passing second. Inside the house, Sheriff James Winters had been dozing in his armchair when the knock startled him awake. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at 9:45 p.m. on Christmas Eve. His first thought was that it must be an emergency. Maybe Mrs. Rodriguez had fallen again, or there was trouble at one of the holiday parties in town. As he walked to the door, he grabbed his badge from the side table out of habit. The porch light revealed a shadow through the glass that seemed small and hunched over. His police instincts kicked in, making him cautious, but something about the way the figure stood there told him this wasn't a threat. The moment stretched between them like warm taffy, neither moving for what felt like forever. Sarah could hear Christmas music playing softly from somewhere inside the house, Silent Night, and the irony wasn't lost on her. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Sometimes the hardest step is the first one, baby girl, but you got to take it anyway. Sheriff Winters reached for the doorknob just as Sarah started to lose her nerve. She had turned to leave, thinking this was a horrible mistake, when she heard the door creak open. The warm air from inside rushed out, carrying the smell of coffee and pine needles. "Can I help you?" the sheriff's deep voice asked, gentler than Sarah had expected. She slowly turned back around, her movements made awkward by her pregnant belly and stiff muscles from the cold. When she finally faced him fully, the sheriff's eyes widened in recognition. The porch light illuminated Sarah's face, showing her dark skin dusted with snowflakes, her eyes large and frightened like a trapped animal's. She was shaking visibly now, partly from cold and partly from fear. Her clothes were clearly not meant for winter, worn sneakers, thin leggings, and a sweater that had seen better days. I'm sorry to bother you so late, Sheriff Winters, Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Her teeth were chattering, making it hard to speak clearly. "My grandmother, Martha Thompson, she used to work at the courthouse. She always said—" Her voice cracked, and she had to take a deep breath before continuing. The sheriff's face changed at the mention of Martha's name. He looked more closely at Sarah's features, and suddenly he could see it. Martha's kind eyes, her proud posture even in distress, the way she held her chin up despite being afraid. Martha had been one of the few people who treated him like a human being when he first became sheriff, not just a uniform with a badge. "You're Martha's granddaughter?" he asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. He remembered Martha talking about her granddaughter, the smart one who wanted to be a nurse, who helped out at church every Sunday, who had her grandmother's spirit and determination. Sarah nodded, and a tear rolled down her cheek. The baby kicked again, hard enough that she gasped and grabbed her belly. The sheriff's eyes followed the movement, and that's when he fully took in her condition. His own eyes began to well up with tears as he understood the full picture. A pregnant teenager, alone on Christmas Eve, seeking help from a stranger because her grandmother once said he was a good man. The world seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, standing in his doorway, Sheriff James Winters knew that whatever decision he made next would matter more than any he'd made in his 20 years wearing the badge. The ghosts of every Christmas past watched as he stood there. His late wife Sarah, who had always taken in strays and helped those in need. Martha Thompson, who trusted him to be the kind of man who'd help her granddaughter. And his own conscience, which had been wrestling with his role in the community these past few months. Snow continued to fall softly around them, and somewhere in the distance, more church bells began to ring. Sheriff Winters didn't hesitate another second. "Please come inside," he said, stepping back from the doorway. "You must be freezing." The warmth from the house reached out like welcoming arms as Sarah carefully stepped through the door, her wet sneakers squeaking on the hardwood floor. The living room was modest but cozy, with an old leather armchair facing a small Christmas tree. Family photos covered the walls, and among them, Sarah spotted something that made her breath catch. A framed photograph of her grandmother, Martha, standing on the courthouse steps with a younger Sheriff Winters. They were both smiling, and her grandmother wore her favorite blue dress, the one she'd saved for special occasions. "That was taken on my first day as sheriff," James said, noticing where Sarah's eyes had landed. "Your grandmother was the first person to congratulate me. Brought me homemade cornbread every Friday after that, for 20 years straight." His voice grew thick with emotion as he remembered. "Said every man needs somebody looking out for him, even if he carries a badge." Sarah's legs were shaking so badly now that she could barely stand. The sheriff quickly cleared some newspapers from an armchair. "Please, sit down before you fall down," he said, his face etched with concern. As Sarah lowered herself into the chair, the baby gave another strong kick, making her wince. "When are you due?" the sheriff asked, hurrying to the kitchen. Sarah could hear him opening cabinets and running water. 3 weeks, she replied, her hands automatically cradling her belly. "But the doctor at the free clinic says it might be sooner." She didn't mention that she hadn't been able to afford a checkup in the past month. The sheriff returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate and an old coat that smelled faintly of mothballs. "My wife Sarah's special recipe," he said, handing her the mug. "She always said hot chocolate could fix anything." He carefully draped the quilt over Sarah's shoulders, his movements gentle, like he was handling something precious. Looking at her more closely now, Sheriff Winters could see all the signs he'd missed at first. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of many sleepless nights. Her clothes were clean but worn, probably washed in bathroom sinks. She was thin everywhere except her belly, suggesting she'd been skipping meals to make whatever money she had stretched further. "You got her eyes, you know," he said suddenly, sitting down in the chair opposite her. "Your grandmother's eyes. Same way of looking at a person, like you can see right through to their soul." He smiled softly. Made it impossible to lie to her about anything. Sarah took a sip of hot chocolate, and tears started falling again. It tasted exactly like the kind your own mother used to make on cold nights. "Grandma Martha talked about you all the time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said you were there the day my mom graduated high school, that you helped pay for her first semester of college books when times were tough." The sheriff nodded, his own eyes growing misty. "Your grandmother helped raise this whole town, in her own way. Kept everyone's secrets, dried everyone's tears. When my wife got sick," he paused, looking at the wedding photo on the mantel, "Martha was here every day with food, even when she was fighting her own battle with cancer." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional pop from the heating vent. Sarah's shivering had finally stopped, and some color had returned to her cheeks. The baby seemed to have settled too, perhaps soothed by the warmth and safety. "Your grandmother had a saying," Sheriff Winters said finally, leaning forward in his chair. "She used to tell me, 'James, God puts people in our path for a reason. Sometimes the blessing isn't just for them, it's for us too.'" He looked at Sarah with kindness in his eyes. "Now, why don't you tell me what brought you to my door on Christmas Eve?" Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Pine Grove in a blanket of white. But inside the sheriff's living room, surrounded by memories of her grandmother and the warmth of unexpected kindness, Sarah Thompson felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Sarah's hands trembled around the warm mug as she began her story. The grandfather clock struck 10, its deep chimes filling the quiet room. "I was a good student," she started, her voice barely audible. "Honor roll every semester. I was going to be a nurse, just like my mama." Sheriff Winters noticed how she used the past tense, as if those dreams were already dead and buried. He'd seen that same look of lost hope in too many young faces over his years wearing the badge. But something in her eyes, that spark of her grandmother's determination, told him this story wasn't over yet. "Marcus and I dated for 2 years," Sarah continued, staring into her hot chocolate. "He was the preacher's son. Everyone said we were the perfect couple." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Until the pregnancy test came back positive. Then suddenly, he couldn't remember my phone number." The sheriff's hands tightened on his armchair, his knuckles turning white. He'd known Marcus's father, Reverend Johnson, for 15 years. They'd worked together on community projects, shared meals, talked about making Pine Grove a better place. The hypocrisy of it all made his stomach turn. "My daddy," Sarah's voice cracked. "He's the head deacon at First Baptist. When I told them, he said I had 2 choices, get rid of the baby or get out of his house." Tears rolled down her cheeks again. Mama just stood there, crying in the kitchen. Didn't say a word while I packed my bag. The baby kicked again and Sarah rubbed her belly automatically. The sheriff noticed the gentle way she touched her stomach, like she was comforting the child inside. It reminded him of how his late wife Sarah had been with their children. Fierce and protective, even before they were born. "I've been staying at the women's shelter," she continued. "Miss Betty's real nice, but tonight they're full up. Christmas brings out all kinds of troubles," she says. Sarah pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "I thought about going to the hospital, telling them I was having pains just to have somewhere warm to sleep. But Grandma Martha always said lying was a sin that follows you home." Sheriff Winters stood up suddenly, startling Sarah. He walked to his desk in the corner and picked up his phone. Sarah watched nervously as he dialed the number, wondering if he was calling social services or worse, her parents. "Amy, it's Dad," he said into the phone. Sarah realized he was calling his daughter. "I know it's late in California, but I need your help." He paused, listening. "Remember how you said your old room was just collecting dust? Well, I got someone here who might need it for a while." Sarah's eyes widened as she understood what was happening. The sheriff continued talking, pacing back and forth. "Yes, she's 17. No, She's not in trouble with the law. She's Martha Thompson's granddaughter. You remember Martha? Another pause. She's due in 3 weeks, Amy. Yes, I'm sure. You know your mother would have done the same thing. Hanging up the phone, the sheriff turned back to Sarah. His eyes were wet with tears, but his voice was steady. My daughter Amy is a social worker in California. She's already looking up programs that can help you. The guest room upstairs is yours for as long as you need it. Sarah started shaking her head. Sheriff Winters, I can't accept. James, he interrupted gently. If you're going to be living in my house, you should call me James. He sat back down, leaning forward in his chair. Your grandmother took care of me for 20 years. Brought me food when Sarah was sick, listened when I needed to talk, kept me honest when I needed straightening out. She'd never forgive me if I turned her granddaughter away on Christmas Eve. A car passed by outside, its headlights sweeping across the room. In that brief flash of light, Sarah saw something change in the sheriff's face, like years of loneliness and grief were lifting away, replaced by purpose. Besides, he added with a small smile, that baby's going to need a grandfather figure who knows how to teach proper fishing techniques. Can't have them learning from just anybody. For the first time in months, Sarah let out a real laugh. It was small and watery, mixed with tears, but it was genuine. The sound seemed to fill the room with warmth, chasing away the last bits of cold and fear that had followed her through the snowy night. Outside, the church bells began ringing again, marking the approach of midnight. Christmas was coming to Pine Grove, and in a small house on Cedar Street, 2 lonely souls had just found their way home. The kitchen smelled of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup as Sheriff Winters, James, as he'd asked to be called, moved around with surprising ease for a man who claimed he rarely cooked. Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, watching him work and feeling the warmth of real food in her stomach for the first time in days. Your grandmother taught me how to make these, James said, flipping another sandwich in the pan. Said every man should know how to feed himself something besides cold cereal. He chuckled at the memory. Course, she also tried to teach me her famous cornbread recipe, but that was a lost cause. Sarah smiled, remembering those cornbread lessons herself. Grandma never measured anything, she said, taking another spoonful of soup. She'd say, baby girl, you got to feel it in your bones when it's right. The familiar ache of missing her grandmother mixed with the comfort of sharing these memories. Did she ever tell you about the time she locked herself in the courthouse? James asked, sitting down with his own plate. When Sarah shook her head, his eyes lit up with mischief. It was during that big snowstorm of '09. She was cleaning late, like always, and didn't realize everyone else had gone home early because of the weather. Sarah leaned forward, eager to hear a new story about her grandmother. The baby seemed interested too, moving gently as if settling in for story time. The emergency lights were on, but the heat was down low to save energy. Your grandmother decided to finish her work anyway, stubborn as a mule, that woman. James smiled fondly. When she tried to leave, the electronic doors wouldn't open. Power was out by then. What did she do? Sarah asked, completely engrossed in the story. Called me on my cell, cool as could be, said, Sheriff, I hope you're not too busy, but I seem to be having a sleepover at the courthouse. James laughed at the memory. I found her in the judge's chambers, wrapped in his robe for warmth, reading case files by flashlight. Said if she was stuck there anyway, she might as well learn something. Sarah giggled, picturing her proper grandmother wearing a judge's robe. That sounds just like her. She never wasted a minute. Her smile faded slightly. I wish she was here now. She'd know what to do about everything. James's face grew serious. Your grandmother knew you better than anyone, Sarah. What do you think she'd say about all this? Sarah was quiet for a moment, absently stirring her soup. She'd probably say that every baby is a blessing, even when they come at unexpected times. Her voice grew stronger, and she'd say that giving up isn't in our family's blood. That's exactly what she'd say, James agreed. Did you know she put herself through night school while raising your mother? Worked 2 jobs, studied whenever she could, said she wanted to show her daughter that it's never too late to chase your dreams. The grandfather clock chimed 11. It sounded familiar now instead of startling. Sarah felt the baby move again and smiled. I still want to be a nurse, she admitted quietly. Even with the baby coming. Is that crazy? Not crazy at all, James replied firmly. Your grandmother went back to school at 45. You're 17 with her spirit and twice her stubbornness. I'd say those odds are pretty good. He got up and walked to a drawer near the stove, pulling out a worn envelope. Martha gave me this last Christmas, said to keep it safe until it was needed. He handed it to Sarah. I think now's the right time. With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the envelope. Inside was a bank book for a savings account and a handwritten letter. As she read her grandmother's familiar handwriting, tears began falling onto the paper. My dearest Sarah, I've been putting aside a little money each month since you were born. Not much. Just what I could spare from cleaning the courthouse and doing alterations. But like I always say, little things add up to big things if you're patient enough. This is for your nursing school. Baby girl, dream big, work hard, and remember that your grandma believes in you, even when I'm not there to say it anymore. All my love, Grandma Martha. Sarah looked up at James through her tears. She knew, she whispered. Somehow, she knew I'd need help one day. James nodded, his own eyes misty. Your grandmother had a way of seeing the future in people's hearts. Now, how about we figure out how to make your dreams happen? I think I know a few people who'd want to help make sure Martha Thompson's granddaughter becomes the best nurse Pine Grove has ever seen. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world quiet and new. In the kitchen of a house on Cedar Street, a young girl holding her grandmother's letter felt her baby kick, as if saying, "We can do this." As midnight approached on Christmas Eve, Sheriff James Winter's house buzzed with unexpected activity. His daughter Amy's voice came through the speakerphone in the living room, her social worker instincts already in full gear despite the late hour in California. "Dad, I've made some calls," Amy said, the sound of her typing echoing through the phone. "I know people at Pine Grove Memorial Hospital. Sarah needs proper prenatal care right away." She paused, then added softly, "Mom would be so proud of you right now." Sarah sat on the couch, still wrapped in the old quilt, listening as these strangers planned to help her. The baby was active now, as if sensing the excitement in the room. James paced back and forth, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Linda at the station has that empty apartment above her garage," he said, thinking out loud. "She was just saying last week how quiet the house is since her daughter left for college." He looked at Sarah. "It would be temporary, just until we figure out something more permanent." "Perfect," Amy replied. "And Dad, remember Carol Watson? She runs that program helping teen mothers finish high school. I'd already texted her. She says she can meet with Sarah next week." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the desperate ones she'd cried earlier. These were tears of hope, of disbelief at how quickly life could change. Just 3 hours ago, she'd been standing in the cold with nowhere to go. The grandfather clock struck midnight, its chimes mixing with the distant sound of church bells. It was officially Christmas Day. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Amy said through the phone. "And Merry Christmas, Sarah. Welcome to our crazy family." After they hung up, James disappeared upstairs for a few minutes. He came back carrying a stack of soft towels and what looked like women's pajamas. "These were Sarah's. My wife's," he explained, setting them down carefully. She always kept extras in case Amy visited unexpectedly. "They might be a little big, but they're warm." Sarah touched the pajamas gently. They were pale blue with tiny flowers, worn soft from many washings. "Thank you," she whispered, overwhelmed by this simple kindness. "The guest room is ready," James continued. "It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it. Bathroom's right across the hall." He paused, then added with a small smile, "Fair warning, the water takes a minute to get hot. You have to sweet-talk it a little, like your grandmother used to say." As Sarah stood to head upstairs, a sharp pain made her gasp and grab her belly. James was at her side instantly, his face concerned. "Just a contraction," she assured him, but her voice shook slightly. "I've been having them on and off all day." James's deputy training kicked in. "How far apart are they?" "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted. "I've been trying not to think about them." James checked his watch, then helped her sit back down. "We'll time them, just to be safe." He pulled out his phone and opened the timer app. "Your grandmother would have my badge if I didn't take proper care of you." Over the next hour, they timed the contractions. Sarah tried to downplay them, but James saw how she tensed with each one. When they got to 5 minutes apart, he made an executive decision. "We're going to the hospital," he said, already reaching for his coat. No arguments. I know the head nurse on the maternity ward. Margaret's been there 30 years. She helped deliver both my kids. Sarah started to protest about not having insurance, but James held up his hand. Your grandmother took care of this whole town for 30 years. Now it's time for the town to take care of her granddaughter. As they walked carefully to his police cruiser, the Christmas lights from neighboring houses lit their way. James helped Sarah into the passenger seat, then quickly scraped ice off the windshield. The streets were empty and peaceful, covered in fresh snow that glowed under the streetlights. You know what this means? James asked as he started the car, trying to keep Sarah's mind off the contractions. This baby might be born on Christmas Day. Your grandmother would have loved that. Sarah managed to smile between contractions. She always said Christmas was when miracles happened. James thought about how his quiet, lonely Christmas Eve had turned into this moment, driving Martha Thompson's granddaughter to the hospital, about to become an honorary grandfather. Yeah, he said softly, turning on the cruiser's lights to guide their way through the snowy night. I think she was right about that. At 7:15 a.m. on Christmas morning, baby Martha Grace Thompson came into the world with a powerful cry that echoed through the halls of Pine Grove Memorial Hospital. She weighed 6 pounds, 4 ounces, and had a head full of dark curls just like her mother's. As the sun rose over the small Georgia town, painting the fresh snow in shades of pink and gold, Sheriff James Winters sat in a hospital chair, watching Sarah hold her daughter for the first time. She has Grandma's nose, Sarah whispered, tracing her finger gently over the baby's tiny features. Her voice was tired but filled with joy. And look at those long fingers. Maybe she'll play piano like Grandma did. Margaret, the head nurse who had indeed been there for 30 years, smiled as she checked Sarah's vital signs. I remember your grandmother playing at the hospital Christmas party every year, she said. She never missed one, even after she got sick. News travels fast in small towns, especially on Christmas morning. By noon, Linda from the sheriff's office had arrived with armfuls of baby supplies and the keys to her garage apartment. Already got the heat turned on up there, she announced. And my church group is bringing over a crib this afternoon. Carol Watson, who ran the Teen Mother program, stopped by with information about online high school classes Sarah could start from home. Your grandmother helped my sister through nursing school, she told Sarah. Now it's our turn to help you. But the biggest surprise came just after lunch. James returned from getting coffee to find Sarah crying over her phone. Before he could worry, she looked up with a trembling smile. My mama, she said softly. She saw the Facebook post about the baby. Says she's been looking for me ever since I left. Sarah wiped her eyes. She wants to come see us. Says she should have stood up to Daddy that night, and she's sorry. James sat down beside the bed, watching baby Martha sleep peacefully in her clear hospital bassinet. People make mistakes, he said gently. Especially when they're scared. The important thing is recognizing those mistakes and trying to fix them. By evening, Sarah's mother arrived, carrying a familiar quilt that Sarah recognized from her childhood bed. The reunion was tearful but healing, like spring rain washing away winter's frost. When Mrs. Thompson held her granddaughter for the first time, she whispered, Hello, little Martha. Your great-grandma would be so proud of your mama's strength. 1 year later, Christmas Eve. The lights were on in Sheriff Winters' house, and laughter spilled out into the snowy evening. The small artificial tree had been replaced by a real one that touched the ceiling, decorated with handmade ornaments from baby Martha's daycare class. Sarah's nursing textbook sat on the coffee table, bookmarked with her latest straight-a report card. In the kitchen, Sarah's mother taught James how to make her famous sweet potato pie, while Linda and Carol argued good-naturedly about who would get to hold the baby next. Martha, now a walking, babbling 1-year-old, toddled between everyone's legs, wearing a tiny dress that matched her mother's. Sarah watched it all from the doorway, hardly believing how much had changed in 1 year. She was halfway through her high school diploma, taking extra classes to graduate early. The garage apartment above Linda's house had become a real home, filled with second-hand furniture and first-time memories. And every Sunday, she and baby Martha had dinner with Grandpa James, who had taught the little girl to clap her hands and say badge whenever she saw his uniform. Penny for your thoughts? James asked, coming to stand beside her. Sarah smiled, picking up her daughter as she ran past. Just thinking about last Christmas, she said. about how scared I was standing on your porch, about how Grandma Martha was right about you being a good man. James looked around his house, once so empty and quiet, now full of life and love and the sound of his honorary granddaughter's laughter. Your grandmother was right about a lot of things, he said, especially about miracles happening at Christmas. As if on cue, the grandfather clock began to chime, its familiar sound mixing with Christmas carols from the radio and the happy chatter of their makeshift family. Outside, snow started falling again, soft and gentle, covering Pine Grove in a fresh blanket of white. Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in her baby-sweet smell. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," she whispered toward heaven. "Thank you for showing me the way home." And somewhere, perhaps, Martha Thompson smiled down on them all. The sheriff who had opened his heart, the daughter who had found her strength, and the baby who carried her name into a future bright with promise. The end.